Today we're reviewing Batman the Shadow, a really fun series I enjoyed going over. We'll talk about the Shadow's history as a character and how that relates to Batman, and the brilliant way that this comic book miniseries kind of blends that real-world history in with Batman's actual character history I haven't seen anywhere else. Remember to subscribe to Comic Island for more reviews of comics, new and old. So I really liked this series. One of the issues was selected as part of my random series featuring comics with the Joker in it. I'm willing to admit I knew very little about the Shadow and even less about this crossover miniseries, so I figured, as I've kind of been doing for these random reviews, it was best to look at the entire series as a whole. I found the story at first a genuinely complex and perhaps somewhat confusing mystery. It's an okay mystery with some clues and hints, but deeper truths only revealed much later in the story. But there is a genuine flaw in that there are two characters in this story named Lamont Cranston and Langdon Cranston, and I definitely got those names mixed up at some point during the recaps we made of this series. None of this is the end of the world, because over time this story does become less of a mystery. The puzzle gets solved, and instead we have to deal with the problems at hand, which takes the form of Batman and the Shadow teaming up to face every one of Batman's major villains, the two going into some mystical realm that resembles a dark and twisted variation of Kunlun, and Batman straight up dying. It's all quite ambitious, but feels right up the alley as Scott Snyder, who co-wrote this story with Steve Orlando. Orlando seems to be carrying a lot of weight behind this story based on the way he is credited, but I sense a lot of these ideas are very much Snyder behind the wheel. The fight with Batman and the Shadow against all of Batman's villains seems like the sort of thing he'd think of, for example. The only downside of this being, a lot of these ideas are left underdeveloped. The big battles of this story, including the fights against the Stag, are all very short and don't feel nearly as fun or explored as they should have been. They actually did do a different crossover that follows up on some of this stuff called the Shadow Batman. The best idea that isn't fully explored in Batman the Shadow, but doesn't really need to be, is the crux of the story anyways. The idea that Batman was directly inspired by the Shadow, far more than the Dark Knight ever knew, and that Batman was supposed to one day take the Shadow's place, and finally, that plan has been destroyed entirely, and now Cranston is stuck as the Shadow, while Batman is destined to be the Dark Knight until the day he dies. What I love about this particular plot point is that Snyder and Orlando clearly didn't pull this out of nowhere. This is all tied into who and what the Shadow is, and his already existing history with Batman, both behind the scenes and in older comics. For those that don't know, the Shadow is one of the oldest characters in Western comics. He sort of emerged out of a series of mystery stories, initially as this sort of mysterious narrator, but later as a real character with a real history, drawn from the crossover and real powers present in this miniseries. Batman, as his creators would outright state, was actually directly inspired in part by the Shadow. The Shadow had such a big influence on Batman's character that in the Silver Age, they actually incorporated that into Batman's character history, with the Dark Knight outright declaring he was inspired by the Shadow. This not only established the Shadow as part of DC canon, but as part of Batman's real history as a character. And since most elements of Batman's story were never really fully erased, even across the many reboots over the years, it feels like that sort of thing remains true of Batman going right into this story. He does know about the Shadow at the start of Batman the Shadow, and they seem to maintain that sense of Batman being loosely inspired by him as a character in the story. Because of all of this, I don't view this as a traditional crossover, like say the ones between Green Lantern and Star Trek, where the canon is clearly that of an alternate universe for both franchises. This story very much seems in canon to me. It all fits with what we know about Batman already. It's a more honest depiction of the character that openly acknowledges the role the Shadow played in Batman's actual publication history, and it's cool as hell. Overall, I also enjoyed Riley Rossmo's art. He did a great job at showing off how cool and creepy the Shadow can be to readers old and new. He does something I like too, where all the characters are very expressive. I thought at first that was a bit of a weakness when it came to the Shadow, as he's supposed to come across as this inhumane, unfeeling monster, but is very reactive to the world around them, and is often depicted showing a face of fear. Yet I think that's intentional, and is hinting at his character arc in this story, where the Shadow is very much sort of coming to have to admit he's still human, and as Batman says, he's not above all of this. The Dark Knight very much brings the Shadow back down to the level of the human race in a very positive way in this story, in the form of a strong ending I quite enjoyed. I think that's actually Steve Orlando who created that strong ending for Batman and the Shadow, which really sold me on this series as a whole. It's a cool role for Batman to take on here, sort of bringing the humanity out of the Shadow, very much acknowledging that Batman's own life isn't really a curse or all darkness like Batman might sometimes feel. The student becomes a teacher is a classic trope, but it works so well with the history behind these characters. Batman was inspired by the Shadow, and it would be dishonest to state otherwise, but it would be equally dishonest to pretend Batman hasn't grown or changed a great deal since then, while the Shadow has kind of faded more into the background and more or less stayed the same. By bringing things together in a strong ending, it works really well. Bolstering that is bright and vibrant coloring by Ivan Plascencia, and I think it makes a huge difference in giving so many of these scenes the emotion they need. Action scenes are bright and full of life, while the more sobering ending features a lot more muted colors. This is perfect coloring in a comic book. I don't have a lot else to add, so I'll leave with this. Batman the Shadow was a fun comic that pulled me into its story, and on the whole I enjoyed it quite a bit, even if a lot of stuff was left unexplored. I would probably recommend this series to anyone who is into that sort of thing, and would be okay with a suspenseful half-mystery giving way to a fun bit of action and character work. I did check out as well the other crossover called The Shadow Batman, and I think we might take a look at that one day too. So stay tuned for that, as well as the rest of my random reviews of comics featuring the Joker. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time here on Comic Island.